right, so we're switching gears now to another flashpoint, which is Venezuela. Now, it's no secret that the Trump administration is pushing for what the U.S. wanted to do in Venezuela for over a quarter of a century, which is regime change, and to completely quash the Bolivarian revolution inside of Venezuela. But Latin American countries are not quietly accepting this. Trump's Summit of the Americas has been canceled this week due to stiff opposition, primarily from Mexico and Colombia, to Washington's regime change plans and its military actions inside of the Caribbean. And Russia has said it's open to arming Venezuela with hypersonic missiles. These could carry nuclear warheads that are uninterceptable. Russia has already provided Venezuela with Pantsir S-1 and BUC-M2E missiles already. So President Nicolas Maduro has given the order to arm the country's patriotic militias, totaling some 8 million people, and the government is handing out rifles. Now, we have the recent Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, who just can't wait to be the next dictator of Venezuela, to sell her country to the highest bidder. And she's already claiming that Hamas is operating inside of Caracas, paving the way for U.S. intervention. So joining me now to talk about the situation inside of Venezuela and this military buildup are journalists Camila Escalante and Alan MacLeod. Camila is an editor at Kawsachun News, an alternative media outlet based in Bolivia, reporting on Latin America. And Alan MacLeod, of course, is our senior investigative journalist and staff writer and producer of this show. He published a very important book, Bad News From Venezuela, 20 Years of Misreporting. Make sure to check that out. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Mnar, and good to see you as well, Alan.
Good to be back with you.
So, Camila, I want to start with you. Right now, the United States has a massive military buildup in the Caribbean, pointing to Venezuela for this regime change operation. I think a lot of people are curious to know the military capabilities and arsenal that Venezuela has, considering it's been a sanctioned nation, but it's also been a nation that has been preparing itself for this very moment of a U.S. military operation.
Right. Well, Russia and Venezuela recently signed some agreements to strengthen cooperation in the area of security. And we don't know what exactly that entails. I don't think they're going to be going around bragging about it, because the intent of the Bolivarian government of Venezuela is not to provoke anything beyond what's already taking place in the Caribbean Sea. They want peace. They've been living in peace for a very long time, free of a lot of these attacks and destabilization attempts that we saw during the years of Guaido and prior to that. And they want to maintain Venezuela as a peaceful country. And of course, they're prioritizing dialogue and diplomacy when possible. And they're not in any sort of conflict with the United States as far as Venezuela is concerned. It's purely an aggression that's coming from the United States. Any attack that takes place is coming unilaterally from the United States. And all of the aggression that we're seeing in the Caribbean Sea is a one-way thing. Venezuela is not doing anything. But Venezuela is counting on the military technology of Russia. So, we're not going to know quite all the details of that, but we know that Venezuela does have Su-30s and S-300 missiles, and that it can defend itself and also shoot down U.S. fighter jets and even strike aircraft carriers if necessary. But they're hoping that it doesn't get to that. They're conducting drills on all of their massive borders, and they also have the millions of people that make up the Bolivarian National Civilian Militia, which are just regular people who are now, or some of them have previously, received training from the Bolivarian National Armed Forces on how to do things like operate guns. And in fact, the Bolivarian government of President Nicolas Maduro is arming these people so that they can also fight to defend their country, something you don't see in other countries. And this is only possible, of course, because Venezuela refounded its military and has revolutionary armed forces that it can count on, and which has stood by the president throughout all of the harassment, threats, and attacks that have taken place over recent years, and in particular since 2019, when the United States tried to install Juan Guaido and tried to force a coup during Trump's first administration. Now we're seeing these strikes on vessels in the Caribbean Sea as well as in the Pacific Ocean, which is not surrounding Venezuela necessarily, but these are very hostile attacks, but they're actually just terrorist attacks that we're seeing by the U.S. regime that threaten Venezuela's sovereignty and the sovereignty of all countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And it's being widely rejected, which I'm sure we'll talk about a lot more as our conversation progresses.
All right, so one of the important developments of the week is that during the Summit of the Americas, which is a, U.S.-dominated regional gathering of leaders, has been canceled or officially delayed until next year, it looks like, due to the widespread opposition from Latin American nations to Trump's interventionism in Latin America. I mean, we're definitely seeing a change of tone when it comes to the United States aggression here towards Venezuela. So, Alan, if you can tell us more about why it was canceled and why this is actually a really big deal.
The United States calls Latin America its own backyard, and it has done for 200 years. But that doesn't mean that everyone in the entire region agrees with that. And when the United States just openly and blatantly talks about regime change in another country, invading another country, even right-wing nationalists often in Latin America get the hump with this. They don't like to think of their entire nations as being the playthings of Donald Trump. So when Trump goes around just insinuating that he might invade Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, Cuba, who knows? They don't really like that. And not only that, the regional situation is pretty interesting that there is a split of quite powerful and influential anti-imperialist blocs in the region. I'm thinking specifically about the governments of Mexico and Colombia, led by Claudia Sheinbaum and Gustavo Petro, respectively, who have really come to Venezuela's aid and put a principal stance on this, saying we do not accept interference in foreign countries. We do not accept the bad old days of the 20th century. We don't want to go back to that when the United States would just invade countries at will. And so Mexico and Colombia, two of the most powerful, most populous, largest countries in the region, have put up some significant opposition to this, telling Trump in no small terms that they will not be heading to this summit if this continues. And so ultimately, Trump, Marco Rubio, and the clique around Washington has pulled back and decided to officially delay this summit. As you said, it was supposed to be going on very soon, but it's simply not going ahead because Trump knows that it's going to be a huge PR disaster for him, getting lectured by certain countries saying we don't want regime change, and also from the prospect of sort of mass resignation where heads of state simply don't go to this event. So they decided to take the easy way out and just cancel it or officially delay it for a little while.
And Alan, could you just go over some of these neocon war hawks that are based here in the United States and how they're using U.S. media, even Maria Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, to really push for this U.S. war of aggression with Venezuela?
Yes, well, we're speaking in the wake of the passing of the not so great Dick Cheney, one of the greatest hawks we've seen in Washington's recent history. Unfortunately, the neocons have found themselves a comfortable space in the Trump administration. Perhaps most importantly of all, Marco Rubio, who is Secretary of State, head of USAID. He's got so many titles, it's really unbelievable the amount of power Rubio has. Rubio himself is a Cuban American. and has made Latin America his particular interest for his entire political career. He has typical Cuban American views, which are deeply conservative, one might say reactionary. In fact, when we look at Latin America, he has pushed for more intervention, more wars, more US involvement in so many countries. He is constantly agitating for the overthrow of the Cuban government, the Nicaraguan government, the Venezuelan government, before it, the Bolivian government under Evo Morales. And they start thinking about some sort of ridiculous excuse for this. And right now it's the drug war, which has never really been fought against drugs, of course, because everybody knows the best way of dealing with drug wars with education and counseling in your own country. You don't go to other countries to bomb the crap out of these places to actually prevent drugs coming in. But, Rubio has used this excuse to try to push his decades-long agenda of overthrowing socialist or anti-imperialist governments in Latin America. And he's found a willing ally in some Venezuelans, like you said, Maria Corina Machado, who is a far-right opposition leader who her entire career has basically been spent at the knee of Washington, learning from before Trump and Biden, it was George Bush. She went to the Oval Office in 2005 to meet George Bush. That's how far it goes back. And since at least 2002, her organization, her political group, Sumate, has been sponsored by the NED, which is a cutout organization of the CIA. And this is really how so many people in the right of Venezuelan politics actually work. They don't have that large a political base, but because they have access to enormous amounts of wealth and also the prestige and the power that American politicians and American media can give them, they're really given ideas above their station. Like, for example, Juan Guaido, who proclaimed himself president and for years walked around the country, insisting that he was the real president. And the United States would take this seriously and even give him billions of dollars to try to fund this dream. And Machado is the latest in this succession. It seems very likely that this is not going to work, given her tanking numbers in Venezuela. Certainly last year, she was perhaps the most powerful opposition leader, but her constant calls for the United States and sometimes indeed Israel to attack, bomb, and invade the country has really lost her support, even among right-wing Venezuelans who don't like the idea of their country being turned into the next Libya or the next Gaza or the next Afghanistan, because they've seen for decades now what neocon US intervention does around the world. And, that's Dick Cheney's legacy, a legacy of millions of lives destroyed, millions of people killed, tens of millions of people forced to flee their homes, entire regions of the world being destroyed. That is the reality of the US empire. And that's what Venezuelans absolutely don't want to see. And certainly governments around Latin America don't want to see another failed state in their region, because they know what might happen because of that. So I'm very happy to see that regional governments are pushing back on this. And long may it continue.
Yeah, I mean, I just did an explainer on Sudan, breaking down and dissecting the architecture of U.S. imperialism and how it targets countries that push back against the U.S. dollar and seek independence, and how the export of U.S. imperialism is very simple. It's just creating a failed state, dividing a nation, creating civil war, strife, starvation, genocide, just like what we saw in Sudan and what we saw in Gaza. And I just want to point out for those who are watching that Alan has gone viral so many times for using the Juan Guaido as the interim president. Such a brilliant meme that you've helped establish. But Camila, I want to turn to you. Excuse me. You are reporting on the CELAC EU summit this week, which is an alternative to the Summit of the Americas. So can you speak about this, please?
Well, I wouldn't say it's an alternative, or that's one way to say it. But another way to say it is that it's becoming the main regional integration mechanism, or the mechanism through which CELAC governments, which is the governments of the Caribbean and Latin America, can speak to one another, cooperate with one another, without the presence of the US, Canada, and Europe, or any other foreign arbiter. It's just this region. And so it's really important. What happened, as Ellen said, is that we saw this week the failure and collapse of the Summit of the Americas. It is the OAS Summit of the Americas. It's hosted by the Organization of American States, an organization which is failing, dying, soon to be defunct, largely because it lost legitimacy when Luis Almagro, the former Secretary General, interfered in the elections in Bolivia, and which led to a coup to overthrow President Evo Morales. And so that was a huge turning point. It was already a delegitimized organization because Cuba was not a part of it, and because in 2017, Venezuela announced its intention to leave the OAS. And since then, Nicaragua has also left, and Bolivia should have left. Nevertheless, a lot of members of the Latin American and Caribbean members of OAS had denounced the OAS's involvement in Bolivia, and now that organization doesn't really serve any purpose except to largely to intervene in the countries of our region. And again, it derives the majority of its funding, not only from Washington, but to a lesser degree, but more so than the amount of money that's coming from Latin American and the Caribbean states. It's deriving its funding from foreign European countries. Those governments are what's funding the Organization of American States. It doesn't make any sense. Why do we have foreign governments? They actually have seats as observers in the process that's supposed to be for Americans, that is people from our Americas, that goes from Canada all the way to Chile and Argentina. It's absolutely absurd. So as Ellen said, it's really important to say that that was a huge failure, that they tried to exclude these countries, and that we saw other leaders boycotting it outright. In contrast, President Petro is going to be hosting the CELAC EU Summit in Santa Marta, which is on the Caribbean coast of Colombia. And it's expected to see the attendance of presidents and heads of state from all over the Caribbean and Latin America, and also from Europe, because it's a joint CELAC EU summit. So it's going to be a very important forum. At the same time, there's going to be a business forum. And at the same time, there will be the Cumbre de los Pueblos, the summit of the peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, which will also be hosted in Santa Marta, that will host something like 1,200 representatives of social movements and political parties and different organizations from Colombia and from all around Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is a really important time for this to be happening. If you heard the statements of President Lula, who a lot of times has been at best wishy-washy or unclear about his position on Venezuela, he said yesterday that this CELAC EU summit only makes sense, and it should only be held if we're going to deal with the issue of the strikes by the United States at sea, which represent a threat to our sovereignty and the peace of this region. And I have to concur with that it absolutely doesn't make sense to be meeting all of these countries, the 33 members of CELAC, as well as the countries of the EU, and not deal with the biggest issue today. This is what happens a lot of times when these countries and these governments meet. They avoid the elephant in the room, absurdly, to an absurd degree. They sit there and talk about all these different things, which at other times might be important, such as trade, such as other forms of cooperation. But the big news right now, which is headlining and dominating around the world for the last 2 months, is that a terrorist entity, the United States, is going into the Caribbean Sea and shooting down vessels without any sort of due process, in violation of international law and the human rights of those people who are on board those vessels. We don't know what their precisely being accused of, and we don't know their identities. This information is not being released to any US media outlets or journalists through the government. And so we don't actually know. We just have to take them for their word. But we know that at the same time, it's being accompanied by all of these threats to overthrow the democratically elected leader of a country, which is President Maduro. And so this is what needs to be dealt with at this CELAC EU summit. And I'm sure that President Petro will put it on the agenda because he's been very outspoken about it, outspoken to the point where now he too is a sanctioned leader. He has sanctions on his person. There's not sanctions necessarily on Colombia, the way in which we see economic sanctions placed on the different countries, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua in particular. But he and members of his family and his interior minister have now been sanctioned for some of the positions he's taken and some of the ways in which he's spoken out against so-called Israel, in favor of Palestine and its liberation of its peoples, and also for the way in which President Petro came into office and immediately reestablished diplomatic relations with Venezuela, reopened the border, and made it so that there could be a stronger state presence in that area, which was an area of the Venezuela-Colombia border of complete lawlessness, where the paramilitary groups and drug cartels were actually doing quite well during Ivan Duque's years, the former president of Colombia. So this morning, I attended a press conference of one of the major unions of Colombia, the CUT, and some of the sort of leading or convening organizations of this social movement summit that's going to be taking place parallel to the CELAC EU summit. And they made it very clear that they are going to pressure these governments to ensure that the social movements and the organizations' voice is heard by the summit, to ensure that they deal with this issue, which is the attack on the sovereignty of these countries of the region, and the attack on the Bolivarian revolution and process there by the United States. That this is the most pressing issue right now that needs to be dealt with at this summit. And we're going to see leaders from the Caribbean, of course. Some of them have already confirmed, including Mnar Adley. This will be taking place on Sunday and Monday. The heads of state summit, that is, and a lot of these leaders have already condemned the U.S. Terrorism that's taking place. So it will be very interesting to see the way in which they actually deal with this, because right now it is the responsibility of CELAC to make sure that they stand up to this gross hostility and this rogue action of the rogue U.S. state.
And you mentioned just this transformation of Gustavo Petro. I think right now, Trump has even expressed that he's super frustrated that Gustavo Petro, Colombia's president, will not allow Washington to use the Colombian military to participate in any sort of regime change. And so what have you made of this development? And what is the mood like in Colombia specifically in terms of this new leadership and this buildup to, this U.S. war to Venezuela, considering that Colombia has been a client state of the United States in the past, and now Gustavo is kind of transforming it to more of a resistant state?
Well, President Petro characterizes himself as a progressive. And that's also how he's being characterized by a lot of his base, a lot of his followers, not so much as someone who is prepared to lead a process the way in which President Maduro has led the Bolivarian revolution alongside its other leaders, Diosdado Cabello, Jorge Rodriguez, and so forth in Venezuela. But they have made important changes from the very outset when they came into power and decided to go after the heads of the criminal organizations in this country and deploy the armed forces of Colombia to make it increasingly difficult for these criminal cartels to operate here and to use their traditional drug shipping routes. Now they have to go through lawless places like Ecuador, under the U.S. puppet Daniel Noboa, to be able to ship those drugs all around the world through every other path, but not through Venezuela. Just to touch on Venezuela again, the Bolivarian National Armed Forces have made progress as well, because it is a very large and porous border between Venezuela and Colombia. People in the U.S. might know the distance between the U.S. and Mexico and that border. Venezuela has much larger international borders to deal with on multiple sides. And in recent weeks, the armed forces of Venezuela were able to dismantle what appeared to be ELN camps in the country in more than one location. They showed pictures through their Telegram accounts of what appeared to be weapons and uniforms and other things that pertain to the ELN. And they, of course, do so citing the Constitution of the Bolivarian Republic that says that the territory can never be ceded, transferred, leased, or any way alienated, even temporarily or partially, to foreign states or other subjects of international law, and that the Venezuelan geographic space is a zone of peace, no foreign military bases or installations with any military purpose, which these are armed groups, may be established therein by any power or coalition of powers that threatens the Venezuelan state. So without any distinction of who the groups are or what their political ideology is, Venezuela has the responsibility of making sure that there are no foreign groups or armed groups operating in its territory, and it's doing that right now. And that's really important. So on both sides of the border, there have been advances in taking control of their respective territories. And on the Colombian side, Gustavo Petro has a lot of support to the point where his possible successor, Ivan Cepeda, who will be running as the presidential candidate for the Pacto Histórico next year, seems to be the front runner. And this is a big reason why Colombia is now in the crosshairs of all of this, is because approval for President Petro throughout his administration has maintained for the most part. And he is going to be succeeded by a very popular leader in this country who has also stood up to this narco right-wing paramilitary political oligarchical alliance in the country. And in that case, it seems as if they have a very strong chance of winning the presidential elections in 2026. And that is a complete nightmare for the United States. They know that in order to revert the country to the hands of the oligarchs who are very closely linked with Marco Rubio, with the right-wing Florida lawmakers in the United States and others in Washington, that they're going to need to really expand this campaign against President Petro and against the left here in Colombia to ensure that they don't hold on to power for another period. And so that's what we're seeing right now. Here in Colombia, there's a very strong propaganda campaign against the president in every way conceivable. The sort of anti-Venezuela propaganda that you see on the news and the mainstream media, we see tons of it here in Colombia. They are attacking President Petro in every way possible, trying to delegitimize even the hosting of the CELAC summit, saying that all of the foreign leaders are canceling, which is not true. They are going to attend. They are going to participate, and spreading all sorts of false rumors, and of course, trying to use this claim that has been used forever and ever, that the left and socialists in Latin America and Colombia in particular is tied with narco trafficking, which is absolutely categorically false, to try to delegitimize the president and make it more difficult, including with the sanctions. What they want to do with the sanctions which make it very difficult for banks here in Colombia and internationally, or anyone to have any sort of contracts or any dealings or financial transactions with the president, even after he's completes his mandate as president, is they want to make it so that people distance themselves out of fear for, secondary sanctions or any other repercussions on themselves, and make it so that they can eventually try to cause some sort of factioning or splinters within the left-wing movement and the left-wing political parties here in Colombia. Hopefully it's not going to work. And hopefully people see the similarities between the attacks on President Petro and the left in Colombia now, and the years, if not decades, of slander and propaganda against our leaders in other countries. It's the same sort of propaganda campaigns that Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela have been subject to, but even Rafael Correa in Ecuador and other countries. And another, just to end on a final point, a really important thing that President Petro said yesterday was that part of why this is happening to him, that the U.S. has become so hostile with him, is because he refused to purchase U.S. military aircraft from the United States. And he went with some European ones. And he said that's exactly what happened to Lula. I believe he was referring to that's what happened to Dilma, and that's why Dilma and the PT government fell to a coup in 2016. But that is precisely the case, that the United States doesn't like when a country makes its own sovereign decisions, its own economic decisions, buys military aircraft from other countries, and things like that. And so this is all part of why he's on their blacklist now.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you break the dollar, you break our military, we break your country. I mean, that's should become the new motto of the United States military and government. But, it's really interesting to see this transformation of Colombia with this new leadership, because we have Gustavo Petro, who just returned from Doha, where he met with amputated Palestinian children. But it wasn't just too long ago where Colombia was actually described as the Israel of Latin America. You talked a lot, Camila, about the borders between Colombia and Venezuela. And obviously, Colombia has been this land bridge where the United States has conducted military drills. I'm going to assume that that's where a lot of the money and weapons went to opposition forces. It was through Colombia to topple the Maduro government. Maybe even where the United States orchestrated some of the coups against the Venezuelan government. And now that land bridge is being closed. So Colombia played a really crucial role for the U.S. military and the U.S. government to conduct these sabotages, these sabotaging plans inside of Latin America. And now Gustavo Petro is putting a stop to that. And so, all things Colombia have changed. So could you, Alan, tell us more about Colombia's transformation over the years, and what do you think will happen next with, with my throat is so dry, excuse me, guys, with Gustavo Petro? I don't know, I'm smelling some sort of coup or regime change upcoming to Colombia very soon.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll answer the last question first, which is, the United States, Petro's actions and his thoughts and his outbursts and his statements and what he's done over the past few years has definitely put him in the firing line in Washington's sights. As you said, Colombia has changed incredibly over the past decades. We were talking about a country that for the longest time, and to a certain extent still is called the Israel of Latin America. President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela called them that. And what he meant by that was that Colombia serves the United States empire's role in Latin America very much like how Israel serves its role in the Middle East, being a regional outpost of empire. Colombia was the staging ground for many coups and different military operations in South America. Colombian mercenaries who are links to the drug trade, as Camila was talking about earlier, are constantly used for a lot of the dirty work in Latin America. And Colombia and Israel have had very close ties throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries. So much so that somebody like Juan Manuel Santos, who was president of Colombia, can appear in an ad for an Israeli mercenary company in Colombia while he is still president, and that is just seen as normal in the country. That's because the Colombian military uses Israeli weapons. They drive around in Israeli tanks. They use Israeli armor. They are trained by former IDF and Mossad agents, people like Yair Klein, the very famous Israeli mercenary who was crucial in training up all of these Colombian far-right paramilitaries like the AUC and the Black Eagles and other ones. So Colombia and Israel have these long-standing ties. A lot of the previous governments in Colombia had shared very similar outlook on how the economy and how society should be organized. It was one of Israel's key defenders in a region which has generally been very pro-Palestine. And all that's really changed in the past few years because Gustavo Petro is the first left-wing president in Colombia's history and has flipped that on its head. And instead of taking a conciliatory tone, as many soft left presidents do when they get into power, he's actually really stood up for what he believes in and has fought the power. And he is seemingly unwilling to go quietly and make peace with these sorts of powerful forces. He seems to really want to stand up for what he believes in, and the public is going with it. And you see in opinion poll after opinion poll, despite the enormous propaganda campaign that Camila was talking about against Petro, his opinion ratings in Colombia continue to rise well into the 60s. I mean, you can only imagine an American president with a permanent 60 to almost 70% approval rating. Is almost impossible to think of, but that's the sort of coalition he has been managing to muster and to bring about. And part of that is because of his principal stance against intervention. He doesn't want to see a U.S. intervention in Venezuela. He doesn't want to see lawfare being carried out across the continent, replacing democratically elected governments with U.S.-backed ones. And so Petro his popularity continues to increase. And as Camila said, he can't become president next time because of the term limits in Colombia, but his successor looks to be Ivan Cepeda, who might even be more radical than him. So Colombia is a country in serious flux and serious change, and it's one that many people around the world are looking at as an inspiration.
And I do think that Mexico is seeing also a bit of a transformation with the last two leaders. Currently, we have Claudia Sheinbaum I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly, of Mexico, is also pushing back against Trump's policies, both against her own Mexican nation and in the region. She refused to attend the Summit for the Americas because of the United States buildup inside of the Caribbean. What can you tell us, Camila, about President Claudia of Mexico, and the pushback that Mexico is showing in the face of U.S. imperialism in the region?
Well, Mexico is continuing its transformation process, and they have really important infrastructure projects underway, a lot of just important transformations, and that is at the center of why these last two administrations of AMLO and now Sheinbaum are so popular. And so there have been extreme attempts to try to delegitimize these governments for their very first of all, their very diplomatic approach to the region and the way in which they have not gone along with the hostile attacks against Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And they are now finding themselves in the crosshairs of U.S. hostility because of these positions. There's a lawmaker named Jimenez, I can't think of his first name, in the United States, but he is introducing legislation right now against Mexico for aiding Cuba and for maintaining and legitimizing that relationship with the Cuban government. So the United States is absolutely desperate right now to try to, undermine any government or attack any government which is friendly or in any way just neutral on these different governments of the region that it's trying to overthrow, because ultimately the US is trying to attack not just Venezuela, but also, as Alan said earlier, Cuba. That's, at least part two, if not one of the points along, the agenda that Marco Rubio has as Secretary of State right now. And so they're going to be going after President Claudia for not going along with these U.S. objectives in the region, but they find themselves in a very difficult place because they are a U.S. neighbor, and they also have the presence of the United States within their own borders, and also represented, the U.S. interests are represented through some of the oligarchs and right-wing parties in Mexico, which are operating with foreign funding as well, something that Claudia has tried to crack down on.
And I just want to end the conversation with one last question here, which is there seems to be significant opposition to any sort of U.S. invasion of Venezuela. So I do want to bring this conversation back to Venezuela. Right now, we have Admiral Alvin Halsey, who has resigned from his post as head of the U.S. Southern Command. This happened last month amid widespread speculation of his reluctance to carry out Trump's plan. That's why we believe that he stepped down. And, we've been sitting kind of at the edge of our seat right now. The Trump administration last weekend said, the U.S. military could strike Venezuela any minute now. So, Alan, maybe, I'll ask both of you guys this question, but we'll start with Alan. How likely do you think a full U.S. invasion would be? I mean, would airstrikes be a more believable option right now?
Well, the Trump administration has moved thousands of troops to the Caribbean and is currently moving its largest aircraft carrier in its fleet over to that region as well. However, that's clearly not enough soldiers and forces more generally to actually mount an invasion of such a large country, especially one with such a large military and millions of people in militias as well. So I think right now, the way that they are being so aggressive and so strong kind of it likely suggests a sort of strong while weak, weak while strong, the sort of thing that a dumb guy does in poker when he, pretends he's very strong. My sense is they're probably trying to probe Venezuela for cracks, trying to find fissures among the military, hoping that perhaps forces inside Venezuela or perhaps in their neighbors will do their job for them. I'm certainly thinking that strikes against Venezuela are a distinct possibility because we've already seen that the Trump administration has no problems and no qualms whatsoever about firing on civilian vessels with zero evidence that they are involved in anything shady, even if that would be a justification. So clearly, the Trump administration is trying to provoke something. And in fact, recently Maduro came out and said that the Venezuelan government, the authorities there, had actually prevented a false flag operation against American shipping, presumably in a sort of Gulf of Tonkin incident, or Remember the Main incident, trying to get the United States into its next forever war. Trump, as you said earlier, has authorized the CIA to carry out lethal operations against Venezuela. So the situation is absolutely serious and absolutely perilous. But if Trump thinks that this is going to be another Iraq and it's going to be an easy win, or another Libya where the government will fall quickly, that's not going to be the case. The Venezuelan public, only 3% of them in a recent poll said that they favor an invasion, and the vast majority were categorically against it. So if the United States does invade Venezuela, it might turn into their next Vietnam, another quagmire where huge numbers of Americans and countless Venezuelans will die, and it might take years and years, and they'll achieve absolutely nothing. So we can only hope for peace, but we do have to prepare for war, knowing what Washington is capable of, because we're analysts and we've watched this for our whole lives.
The difficult thing that SELAC will have to take on this weekend when they meet is addressing the fact that the United States continues to have its proxies, its agents, its puppets here in the region. And that's really a big part of the question here. This military buildup is only possible in this extensive form that we're seeing right now because the governments of Trinidad and Tobago, the governments of Guyana and Panama right now, and even Jamaica are allowing the United States to use their territories as military bases for extended periods of time, if not for year-round use, but in particular right now with all of the equipment and troops that we're seeing, as Alan has mentioned. And so they're going to have to deal with that question. Not only how do we address the United States, which is trying to wage another imperialist war and attack an innocent country which doesn't have any real problem, doesn't have any beef with the United States. They just want to be left alone and allowed to carry out their own sovereign project. But also that there are so many willing allies of the United States in this region who are lending themselves to this and providing the space for this to take place without any question. And as Alan mentioned, the false flag that was being planned by this U.S. intelligence, by the CIA, on Trinidad and Tobago's territory was, done so because they have permission to do what they want to there. They are trying to create a scenario in which they make it seem as if some attack happens or some sort of attack on a U.S. Military asset there, and blame it on Venezuela and use that as the justification for a strike on Venezuelan land. Despite that, by the way, people in the United States, according to the YouGov survey, which was just carried out, overwhelmingly do not support strikes on land targets in Venezuela, an invasion of Venezuela, or anything of the sort. Neither Democrats or Republicans. And so they're supporters, that is, voters, not speak of politicians themselves. And so this is going to have to be addressed because if you see what people are saying online, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, they're not happy with the way in which their country is being used to wage a war against a neighboring country that is just kilometers away from them. And other people from the rest of the Caribbean and Latin America are saying the same thing, that our country should not allow our territories to be used for war. They're saying that in Jamaica, they're saying that in Barbados, they're saying that in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, etc. And so these are some of the questions that are going to have to be put on the table and discussed this week in SELAC, is how do we protect ourselves from a new war coming to our region? We've already seen this military foreign occupation in Haiti, which has been going on some time, and we see the United States put down its tentacles and Southcom occupy different areas of Latin America, including Colombia. But we haven't seen an actual land invasion and bombing for some time, the last being the bombing of Panama City in 1989, and previous to that, the invasion and attack on Grenada. And so that's what needs to be discussed right now. All of this has nothing to do with what they're saying now, drug trafficking, or the fight against fentanyl. Clearly, it has everything to do with oil. It has everything to do with gaining access to the natural resources of our continent, first being the oil reserves of Venezuela and Guyana and Suriname and Trinidad. And then the rest of the resources, and also making sure that ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, no longer has any capacity to influence this region of the world, and also conduct its own relations with, or carry out its own relations with, other countries of the global south, something that President Maduro has been advocating for. He is a strong proponent of a multipolar world, and a world in which the United States no longer dominates. They are fighting against neocolonialism, against imperialism, and for the right for each country and people to be able to decide how they want to live their lives, how they want to organize their society and their economy. In the case of Venezuela, it's towards socialism. They're building Bolivarian socialism, led by previously Hugo Chavez, now the Chavistas, and that's all they want. They just want to be left alone, but the United States will not allow it.
And it's so important to hear someone's perspective like yours, based on your experience living in the global south, living in these South American countries, and seeing firsthand, Camila, you have seen firsthand just the devastation of U.S. imperialism on these nations. It's so refreshing to hear, your reporting and you educating us about the true realities on the ground, because, we are bombarded with U.S. corporate media propaganda that paints this really bad picture about what socialism is in South America. I mean, we have headline after headline always saying, look at Venezuela. The people are starving there because of socialism. Look at, the food shelves are empty, all of these things. Of course, I traveled to Venezuela. I've seen with my own eyes that the people there are living a good life under the Bolivarian Revolution. But what I did see is a devastation of the economy there, not because of socialism, but because of U.S. sanctions and sabotage. And so that's really the context that's really missing from this conversation when it comes to U.S. corporate media coverage. But anyways, thank you both for being here. Alan MacLeod is also an expert on U.S. propaganda against Venezuela. He wrote a whole book about it, so everyone needs to check that out. I mentioned it in my intro. And it's just really an honor to have you both here educating us about this situation. So thank you so much.